The first thing Nora Reyes lost was her home, not to fire or flood or bad luck, but to a letter in a white envelope that said, "Termination Notice." She had signed every page with faith that her hospital would protect her, that honesty mattered. Instead, the hospital board sold the building, buried the evidence, and told her she was no longer needed. That morning, as movers hauled out 20 years of her life, she stood on the sidewalk with a single box of belongings, a framed photo of her parents, a stethoscope, and a small silver cross. Behind her, the automatic doors shut for the last time, and the sound was sharper than any goodbye. Nora was 34, a registered nurse from Dallas, Texas. She had no husband, no children, and no plans beyond the next shift. For 15 years, she'd worked the night wards, the kind where people came in broken and sometimes left that way. Her co-workers used to call her the calm one, because no matter how loud the chaos, Nora's hands never shook. But calm doesn't save you when the people above you decide truth is inconvenient. 1 month before she lost her job, Nora reported a trial medication that was killing patients instead of healing them. She thought she was protecting lives. Instead, she had signed her own exile. When the notice came, there were no hearings, no apologies, just a transfer file stamped Port Bellemare Correctional Facility, Louisiana, a prison hospital. To them, it was a demotion disguised as mercy. To Nora, it was a reminder that in this world, even mercy had paperwork. She drove alone for 9 hours, the road stretching through flat, swampy land that smelled of salt and rain. The radio barely worked. At every rest stop, she asked herself if she should turn back, and at every stop she didn't. The farther she went, the quieter the world became, until even her own heartbeat felt too loud. The gates of Port Bellemare rose out of the mist like the ribs of a dead whale. Steel, rust, and silence. A sign read, "No one leaves without clearance." Inside, the air was colder, heavier, as if it had learned to carry secrets. She met the warden first, Calvin Briggs, a man whose smile looked carved into his face. "You'll find we run a tight ship here," he said. "Follow procedure and you'll be fine." Nora nodded. That was all she ever did now. Nod, obey, survive. Her new quarters were small, a cot, a desk. A mirror cracked through the middle. She looked at her reflection, one face split in two, and almost laughed. The woman on the left was the nurse who once believed in saving lives. The one on the right was the nurse who'd learned that truth has a price tag. Outside, thunder rolled across the bayou. The night lights flickered, and for a moment, the whole prison seemed to breathe. Nora unpacked her things, placed the silver cross beside the bed, and whispered a quiet promise to herself. She would keep her head down, do her work, and never, ever care again. But the walls of Port Bellemare had their own plans. And deep inside those walls, among the patients no one wanted, the inmates no one remembered, someone was waiting for her. On her second week at Port Bellemare, Nora began to understand what silence really sounded like. It wasn't peaceful. It was the sound of men who had given up talking, of guards who stopped asking questions, of machines that hummed to fill the space where compassion used to be. The infirmary was her new home. Concrete walls painted over too many times, a window sealed shut, a shelf stacked with expired bandages. Every patient wore the same gray uniform. Every face carried the same look, tired, waiting, hollow. But there was one man whose eyes didn't look like the others. His name was Elijah Carter, 46, convicted for corporate fraud and obstruction of justice. To most, just another inmate. To Nora, from the first glance, something about him felt contained, controlled, like a storm that had learned how to hide. He was assigned to clean the clinic floors, and he did it with precision. Like every sweep of his mop was a sentence he owed to himself. He never spoke unless spoken to, but every time Nora turned away, she could feel his gaze lingering, not crude, not curious, just aware. The kind of look that said, "I see you trying to disappear." One afternoon, she dropped a tray of medication bottles. They scattered across the floor, glass rolling everywhere. Before she could bend down, Elijah was already there, kneeling beside her, his hand steadying the last vial before it hit the ground. Their fingers touched, a quick electric brush through her glove. She pulled back instinctively, but the warmth stayed. He looked up, his voice low, calm. "You treat us like people." Her answer came out before she could stop it. "You are people." He smiled then, not in gratitude, but in disbelief, as if he hadn't heard those words in years. When he stood, their height met for a second too long. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. Behind them, the old fluorescent light buzzed, flickering between brightness and shadow. For a moment, neither moved. That night, back in her quarters, Nora couldn't shake the feeling. Her hands still tingled where the glove had touched him. She washed them once, then twice, then again, until the water turned cold. Still, the warmth stayed. Days passed. Their exchanges were simple. "Morning? Vitals look good? Drinking more water?" But beneath every word was a pulse that neither of them named. He began leaving her small signs of quiet respect, equipment cleaned before shift, notes of inventory written neatly, never a word more than necessary. It wasn't attraction, not in the way the world defined it. It was something older, something human. Two people recognizing the same kind of wound. Late one evening, she saw him sitting by the window bars, staring out toward the swamp. Lightning flashed, and for an instant she saw the outline of his face, calm and unbroken. She wanted to ask what he was thinking, but she didn't. In this place, words could turn into evidence. Still, as she turned away, he said quietly, "I didn't used to believe in forgiveness. Not until I came here." Nora paused, the words catching her in a way she didn't expect. "Forgiveness?" she asked softly. He looked over his shoulder, meeting her eyes. "It's harder than freedom." The lights flickered again. The storm outside was getting closer, wind pressing against the glass like a warning. She told herself not to look back. But she did. And that was the first night she dreamed of him. Not as a prisoner, but as a man standing in the rain, holding out something she couldn't yet see. The first time Elijah spoke more than a sentence to Nora was the day the generator failed. The whole prison went dark for 8 seconds. Long enough for the monitors to flatline, the alarms to stutter, and every heart inside those walls to forget its rhythm. When the lights returned, Nora was still standing in the infirmary, her hands gripping the counter, breath shallow. Elijah was beside her, calm, his voice low. "Don't move," he said. "The backup takes a few minutes to steady." She hadn't realized how close he'd gotten until she felt the heat from his shoulder through the thin fabric of her scrubs. For a heartbeat, they stood there in silence, the air between them charged and alive. When the system finally hummed back to life, Nora stepped away. "Thank you," she murmured, her tone professional, her pulse not. He only nodded, eyes lowered, but there was a trace of something behind them. The faintest recognition, the kind that made her uneasy and curious all at once. Over the next few days, Elijah became impossible not to notice. He worked with precision, wiping down instruments, arranging supplies, as if he were still in an operating room instead of a prison. The other inmates respected him or avoided him. Nora wasn't sure which. Rumors said he used to be a research engineer, others claimed a fraud. No one really knew, and Elijah never corrected them. One morning, he approached her desk quietly. "Ma'am," he said, "the man in cell 12 isn't faking his pain. The dosage you gave him won't hold." She frowned. "And how do you know that?" "I've studied that drug. I know what it does after 4 hours." There was no arrogance in his tone, just fact. And he was right. That night, when she updated the medical chart, she wrote his name in the margin, Elijah Carter. Observation accurate. She shouldn't have done that, but she did. The next afternoon, She found a folded piece of paper tucked under the medication tray, her name written in careful, clean letters, Nora Reyes. Inside, only one line. If you ever want to know the truth, meet me in the clinic after lights out. She tore the note in half. Then, 10 minutes later, she taped it back together. By midnight, the prison had gone quiet. The cameras in the East Wing flickered, as they always did during the storm season. Nora walked through the dim corridor, the air thick with humidity and risk. When she opened the clinic door, Elijah was sitting on the cot, hands cuffed in front of him, a small envelope resting on his knees. "You came," he said softly. "I shouldn't have." "I know." He lifted the envelope, eyes steady. "This isn't about me. It's about what they buried, and who they ruined to keep it buried." His voice was tired, not desperate. "I didn't steal from anyone, Miss Reyes. I tried to stop them. I sent reports, I begged the board. When the deaths started, I threatened to go public." He looked up at her then, and for the first time she saw the grief behind his restraint. They needed someone to blame, and I was convenient. Nora didn't move, but something inside her did. Her throat tightened. Her chest ached, that quiet ache that came when truth met disbelief. He slid the envelope toward her. "Inside is a name. Someone you can trust outside these walls. That's all I ask, my final wish." She didn't touch it. "This could cost me everything." Elijah smiled faintly. "You already lost everything, didn't you?" The lights above them flickered again, humming softly. Outside, thunder rolled across the bayou. Nora reached for the envelope, slow, hesitant. Their hands brushed. The same current as before, but heavier now. It wasn't attraction, it was recognition. Two people exiled by the same lie. When she left the clinic, the night smelled of rain and metal. She pressed the envelope to her chest and told herself it was just paper. But somewhere deep down, she knew. It was the beginning of something that would undo them both. For 2 days, Nora kept the envelope hidden beneath her mattress. She told herself she wouldn't open it. She'd made enough mistakes trying to save people who didn't want saving. But every time she changed the sheets or closed her eyes, she could feel it there. A heartbeat made of paper and ink. On the third night, she gave in. Inside was a single folded note and a name written in careful block letters, Ava Price, Dallas Chronicle. Beneath it, 2 words, "She knows." Nora sat at her desk, staring at the wall clock as if it could tell her what to do. Her old hospital had gone quiet about the drug trial, but she remembered the whispers. 1 nurse dismissed, 2 patients buried before their time. If Elijah was telling the truth, then she hadn't just lost her job. She'd been part of something far worse. By morning, she made a decision. In the supply closet, she used the inmate phone, dialing the number on the note. The line crackled before a woman's voice answered, brisk and wary. "Price. This is a nurse from Port Bellemere. I think you were looking into the Henderson case." A pause, then softer. "I was, until someone paid me not to." "What if I have proof?" "Then you better pray your phone isn't tapped." The line went dead. That evening, the warden called her into his office. Briggs's smile was practiced, the kind men wore before they drew blood. "Miss Reyes," he said, "I hear you've been spending extra time in the infirmary after hours?" Her pulse jumped. "Routine checkups." He leaned back, fingers tapping the desk. "Let's keep it that way. I'd hate for you to find yourself reassigned again, maybe somewhere with fewer windows." She nodded once and left. That night, she couldn't sleep. She walked the corridor past the darkened cells, the smell of bleach and rain hanging in the air. When she reached the clinic, Elijah was already there, mopping the floor like he'd been waiting. He didn't look up. "You talked to her?" he said. Nora froze. "How do you know?" "She called my daughter after you did." He turned toward her then, cuffs glinting under the fluorescent light. You have to get that file out of here. Everything you need is in the cabinet marked C9. They'll move it before the week's over. She hesitated. If I get caught, they'll bury you the way they buried me. The storm outside cracked like a gunshot. Without another word, she went to the cabinet. The lock was rusted, fragile. She slipped a thin scalpel into the gap and pried. The drawer gave way with a metallic groan. Stacks of files, chemical codes, test names, dosage reports signed under someone else's name, Elijah Carter. Her hands shook. Behind her, the footsteps of a guard echoed down the hallway. Elijah moved fast, pulling her into the narrow space between the shelves, his chest pressed against her back, his breath warm against her ear. "Don't move," he whispered. The flashlight beam swept past, lingering for half a second too long, then faded. Neither of them breathed. In the silence that followed, she could feel his heart, steady, deliberate, beating against her spine. When the sound of footsteps disappeared, she stepped away, her throat tight. "I shouldn't be here." He looked at her, eyes dark, unreadable. "You already are." She gathered the files, tucking them beneath her coat. As she turned to leave, Elijah said quietly, "Whatever happens, don't let them turn you into what they turned me into." She stopped, hand on the doorknob. "And what's that?" "A believer." When Nora finally made it back to her quarters, she locked the door and slid the files beneath the bed beside the envelope. Outside, lightning split the sky over the bayou, and the prison's power flickered again. For one instant, she saw her reflection in the cracked mirror, half light, half shadow. And she realized something she hadn't in years. She was afraid again. The fever came suddenly. By dawn, Elijah couldn't stand. The guards found him slumped against the wall of his cell, trembling, sweat beating down his face like rain against stone. They called for Nora. When she arrived, the infirmary lights flickered again, the same failing hum that had followed her since the night she met him. Elijah's skin was hot, his pulse thin and fading. She tried to keep her voice steady. "Get the oxygen ready," she told the assistant, "and call the doctor." But Briggs's voice came over the intercom before anyone could move. "No doctor tonight. The system's down. Do what you can." She turned off the mic. What I can wasn't enough. The drugs she needed were locked. The key was in Briggs' office. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at Elijah's chest rising and falling under the sheet. Slow, uneven. He opened his eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "I'm your nurse." "No," he said, shaking his head. "You're the only one still listening." The words hit harder than any confession. She reached for his hand, gloved, sterile, safe, but he stopped her. "Don't," he said weakly. "Not like that." She froze, staring at him. Then slowly she peeled the gloves off her fingers, one at a time. The sound of latex snapping echoed in the small room. Her bare hand found his, and the heat of his skin burned through her bones. "You don't have to do this," he whispered. "I already did." The rain outside began to fall harder, drumming against the barred window. Nora took a cloth, wiped the sweat from his neck, from the line of his jaw. Each touch felt heavier than the last. Not out of desire, but grief. The kind that comes when you finally care too late. Elijah's breath grew shallow. He looked at her with that calm that had once frightened her. "If they come for you," he murmured, "don't run. Just tell them the truth. You're better at that than I ever was." "Stop talking," she said softly. "Save your strength." He smiled, barely. "Strength isn't what I need now." His hand tightened weakly around hers. Nora leaned forward, her forehead almost touching his. The monitor beeped slower, slower still. For a long second, there was no sound except the rain and their breathing. And then, silence. The line went flat. Nora's shoulders shook, but she didn't move away. She stayed there, holding his hand, until the warmth faded. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. You're free now." She sat beside him through the night, watching the gray light of morning slide across the floor. When the guards came to take the body, she stopped them. "1 minute," she said. They waited. She took the small cloth she'd used to wipe his skin and folded it carefully into her pocket. A piece of proof, a piece of him. As the door closed behind them, she turned back to the empty cot and whispered to the walls, "You kept your promise. Now I'll keep mine." The storm outside began to break, sunlight creeping through the cracks in the clouds. For the first time in years, Nora felt something move inside her. A quiet ache, something like grace. The news broke 3 days after Elijah's death. A headline on the evening broadcast: "Pharmaceutical giant under federal investigation. Whistleblower case reopened." Nora stood in the staff lounge, the flickering TV washing pale light across the walls. The words whistleblower and fraudulent data filled the room, and for the first time, her hands went still. She knew Ava had found the files. The story had gone public, too fast, too loud. But instead of relief, Nora felt something heavier settling inside her chest. Grief without a place to go. They came for her the next morning. Not the police, the administration. A suspension notice, an escort to the gate. No goodbye. The same quiet ending she had lived before. As she packed her few things, Briggs appeared at her door. His voice was calm, almost kind. "Whatever you think you did here, Miss Reyes, it won't change the world. Men like Carter come and go. The system stays." Nora met his eyes. "Maybe, but the truth stays longer." He said nothing, just watched her walk out into the rain. Back home in Dallas, her apartment felt too clean, too untouched by the world she'd just left. She unpacked her bag, one item at a time, her ID badge, the stethoscope, and the small cloth she'd folded the night he died. It still smelled faintly of antiseptic and iron. When she turned on her laptop, her inbox was full. Reporters, lawyers, people she'd never met. She ignored them all. At the bottom, one unread message stood out. From Ava Price. Subject: "You were right." The email was short. The documents traced back to Henderson. Federal charges filed. They called Elijah a criminal for 10 years. You made him a witness. Nora stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then she shut the laptop and went to the sink. She turned on the faucet, watching the water run cold over her hands. It should have been a relief. But as the drops hit her skin, she remembered the warmth that used to live there. The pulse beneath her palm, the sound of his voice whispering, "Don't let them turn you into me." She pressed her hands together, as if trying to hold on to something that wasn't there anymore. The truth had set her free, but it had taken everything with it. Later that evening, the sunset poured through the blinds, painting the room in the same copper light as the prison walls. She picked up the folded cloth from the counter and whispered, "You kept your promise, Elijah. Now they'll know who you really were." Her reflection in the window looked older, softer, almost at peace. And as the day faded, the line between grief and forgiveness blurred, until she couldn't tell which one she was living anymore. A year passed before Nora went back to Louisiana. By then, the news cycle had moved on. The company's name had changed, the lawsuits had faded into settlements, and the story of the man who told the truth was just another headline buried beneath newer ones. But for her, it hadn't ended. It was still there, quiet, unfinished, waiting. Port Bellemare stood exactly as she remembered. The same rusted gates, the same still air. Only this time, she came through as a visitor, not an employee. The guards didn't recognize her. They never do. Time turns faces into strangers. Beyond the fence, just past the chapel, was a small patch of ground the inmates called the Hill. It wasn't much. A few crosses made of scrap wood, names scratched by hand. Elijah Carter's lay near the back, half hidden beneath wild grass. Someone had placed a piece of string around it, braided like a child's bracelet. Nora knelt, brushing the dirt from his name. She didn't cry. She'd done enough of that for both of them. Instead, she pulled from her coat pocket the folded cloth she had kept, the same one she'd used to wipe his forehead that night, and laid it gently over the wooden cross. The wind off the bayou was soft, warm. For a moment, it felt like breath. She spoke quietly, as if afraid to disturb the air. They cleared your name. They called you a hero. But that's not what you were, was it? You were just a man who refused to lie. The church bell rang somewhere behind her, hollow and slow. She looked up, watching sunlight break through the gray. It fell across the grave in stripes of gold. A kind of grace you don't pray for, but get anyway. Before she left, she opened her phone to one new email. From Grace Carter. Subject: He told me about you. The message was short. He said you were the last person who saw him as more than a number. I wanted you to know I kept his letters, and the light on my porch, it stays on every night. For him, for you. Nora smiled, tears soft at the edges. She replied with only one line. The truth survived. As she walked away, the wind carried the sound of the bayou, the slow hum of cicadas, the rustle of reeds, the life that goes on even after loss. In the distance, the prison lights flickered to life, one by one, like stars that had forgotten how to die. Nora didn't look back. Some stories weren't meant to be watched, only remembered. She drove until the prison disappeared in the mirror, until the sky opened wide and the world turned gold again. Her voice in the silence was almost a prayer. He asked for truth, and what he left behind was faith.